Welcome to Real Talk About Marketing, an Acxiom podcast where we explore real challenges and emerging trends marketers face today. At Acxiom, we love the solve and helping the world's leading brands realize the greatest value from data and technology.
Welcome to Acxiom's Real Talk About Marketing podcast. I'm Kyle Holloway, your host, and I'm here with my co-host, Dustin Rainey. As you all may know, Real Talk is focused on the convergence of ad tech and martech and how strategies and technologies continue to disrupt the status quo across the industry. And today we get to dive into the mega relevant and ever hyped topic of artificial intelligence. Dustin, just yesterday we were joking about replacing you with a trusty AI chatbot named Dusty that could answer all the questions about Acxiom products and services. But the truth is, we aren't that far from that reality. We have lots to discuss, so I'm excited that we get to jump in with our esteemed guest, Graham Wilkinson, EVP, Global Head of AI, Chief Innovation Officer for Acxiom. Graham, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, now, Graham, that is a heady job title. So why don't you start by giving us a snapshot of your background and how you came to your current role?
Yeah, and it's a heavy story. Well, heavy is probably not the right word. It's a long story. I'll try and keep it short. So originally I'm from Manchester in the north of England, and I started my career in advertising. I was in-house at a finance business, and I was actually the head of creative design there. At a young age, I'd taught myself to build websites, but also to kind of do graphic design as well. And so I made my way through the ranks there, and then I was actually laid off during the GFC, and I went to work in an agency after that, and from there kind of learned the ins and outs of media. I was at I was at a lucky kind of point I think, in the evolution of advertising, the emergence of digital. It was just a kind of sweet spot where I was allowed to go and play around with all these things like search and social and video ads, but then also do more traditional things. Like I used to do a lot of direct mail, whether it was from a graphic perspective or also dealing with partners like Experian, and buying lists from them. And then a really good friend of mine moved to Australia, and he was like, "Yeah, you would love it over here. They need people like you, and you should see what it's like." And I'd never been. I'd never even been on vacation. My wife had been once as a child, on vacation, and we're pretty pragmatic, so we were kind of okay, let's do it, and did some job interviews. Ended up emigrating to Australia, was there for 7 years, and worked for Dentsu. There I kind of led various agency functions, but then started to get more formally into the technology side of things, and was leading um, product for the agency group out there. And then I was headhunted to come to New York to go and be the global head of product for Reprise, which is now part of Kinesso. And they kind of hadn't really had a formal global head of product before. I was tasked with obviously bringing productizing services, but bringing new technology out to the business, and that was 8 years ago now. I mean, it's almost 8 years to the day, funnily enough, since I moved to the US and took on that role. Um, and 2 years into that, I then, I was tapped on the shoulder and asked to join Kinesso as the lead for product innovation. Since then, I've kind of formally been leading R&D teams, innovation teams, and luckily, I know enough math, enough development, and enough about a lot of things to be dangerous, but equally smart enough to know to employ very smart people, and work with smart people like yourselves. So, funnily enough, I've worked with you two guys probably longer than most people at Acxiom, and my R&D team quite intimately.
Love your R&D team, Graham. Super bright folks for sure. just like you. And by the way, like for our listeners, around the Acxiom parts and honestly around IPG, Graham is kind of becoming synonymous with AI. The R&D space is really inundated, right, Graham, in the AI space right now. That's where everyone's looking. So let's kind of start maybe the conversation around AI kind of at a high level. Gartner says 1 in 5 U.S. adults now go straight to the AI tools like ChatGPT to ask even the simplest questions every day, right? It's not just complex questions like how should I send this text to my wife in a way that I'm not going to get in trouble, right? Like literally people and all this stuff's getting fed inside of an engine, a back-end database where natural language is kind of making use of all that. What are some other ways that you're seeing consumer behaviors change and shift, and how do you see that really impacting the work that we do on a day in day out basis in data-driven marketing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really interesting question, and it's probably one of the most common questions I get from for brands that we work with, but also a really hard question because it's such like emergent behavior at the moment, and we can in many ways go off the things that we experience and that we're doing personally, which is the easiest thing to attach to. But I still feel like we've barely scratched the surface of how this is going to change behavior for consumers. And I think that kind of that little bit of scratching at the moment, you can predict. I don't know if we're really seeing it, but you can definitely predict shorter consumer journeys, right? This has been talked about really since generative AI became a thing. This idea that you no longer have to troll through websites and search results, and you're just gonna like say, "Hey, I want to go and plan a trip," and it's going to recommend hotels and restaurants and all these different experiences. And so when you analyze that experience, you say, "Well, that's just shortened something that was already relatively short compared to like the pre-digital era, and now it's shortened it even further." Now, again, it's very much prediction because you could also see behavior kind of push back against that. You could quite easily predict that too and go, well, maybe people like that experience of looking for things themselves. So as much as it makes total sense for journeys to be shortened, I don't think that is like done and dusted and we go, yes, they'll definitely always be shorter. I think that we'll probably see categories and certain tasks that might stay the way they are, or maybe even elongate. I think that this idea of discovery using AI is a really interesting one too, because and that's why search is this battleground that everybody is talking about in the advertising industry, because it looks and it feels like kind of AI, or AI looks and feels like search, but it's inherently different. And I kind of think about it as two ends of a spectrum. You've got Google, who have this, let's be honest, this Rolls Royce of a search engine that has been the top dog for a long, long time. And then you've got these platforms like ChatGPT and Perplexity that come out and think about maybe organizing data in a different way, because that's really what this is about. There are two really strong arguments that the way you index information for search in Google is maybe there's not a better way of doing it than that. But people expect augmented results that are kind of chat like, because now that's the behavior that they've got. But then you go ChatGPT and Perplexity and other platforms that say, well, maybe organizing data in things like vector stores and embedding it, so maybe there's a different way of approaching it, can get to that level of accuracy and maybe then go even further beyond that. And I think what we're seeing is these solutions appearing somewhere along that spectrum, where they use maybe a traditional search technique and augment with generative AI, or they use more modern like generative vector embedding based kind of search techniques and then still augment with generative AI.
Man, it is fascinating. I kind of want to double click on Google for a second, because like I think just yesterday, and this was kind of enlightening to me, in my experience, because I guess I've been using ChatGPT for so long now, to do what search used to do for me. I kind of was like, well, what if I go search the same thing? So I went out to Google, and they gave me the option for the first time. It's probably been out there for a little bit longer than where they literally changed my entire user experience, where now the chat bot is the search engine, and the entire way of my page, my screen looks is different, right? So now that prompt is taking up the entire screen. It's giving me an in-depth response, similar to, I mean, it's Gemini, right? But like, are they losing out? That's kind of a risk, if you ask me, because if you think about how they monetized search was through all of the sponsored ads and stuff like that. So the space, the real estate on the screen, is shockingly different. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, so I think about two things as you kind of saying that. One, I think about Google has this advantage because it has an ecosystem, an operating system, right? Just like Apple has. And, the reason that OpenAI have gone out and obviously bought Johnny Ive's business is so that they can start to build an ecosystem, because these days it's not enough to have a platform, because users want convenience, and they kind of as much as the notion of being behavior being monitored and tracked is not palatable to most people. They like the benefits of ecosystems, where when you move from one part of the Google ecosystem to another, that it knows who you are, and that they no longer have to keep kind of saying, hey, this is who I am. Can you please like tailor the experience to me? So I think you're absolutely right. Commercially, it's a really tough one for Google, and I still don't think we've seen what the new generative ad experience is like. What we're doing is we're comparing legacy digital era ad experiences, and we're trying to like squish them in with this new technology and this emergent behavior, and going, oh well, it kind of doesn't work out. Like, I'm losing real estate on a page. How will Google make money? How do I? But I think the bit that's missing right now is, what does generative advertising look like? I start to think about all these crazy things of, why wouldn't an ad be served with some sort of a small model embedded in it in the future? And that ad, the notion of anything being static and having to be approved as a version becomes obsolete. And actually, these ads are just organic, and they morph because they're actually powered by individual models that are trafficked with the ad themselves. And then I think about things like, how will the success or the engagement of an ad be judged? Will it be judged on the depth of the conversation you get into? So could you get into like a cost per token commercialization model, where the longer you have a conversation with a model or an agent or a series of agents, the more that the brand has to pay for that? But then you could go even further and say, well, maybe, thinking about the whole kind of the keyword auction that Google created, maybe there's a version of that starts to think about, I suppose, the value of words that are part of a conversation. So is salience, does that become a really key component of the value of the conversation? If you're having lots of conversation, but there's very little salience in what is actually happening in that conversation, what value is it to you as a brand? Whereas if you've got lots of really salient words that are relevant to you, your products, your brand, maybe you should have to pay more for them. So I know I kind of digressed there, but I think the generative ad experience is the bit that's missing, that is the bit that is making this whole thing jar to us in the advertising industry, because we are really looking at legacy ad formats with a new technology, and the formats haven't moved forward yet.
Yeah, yeah, that's really thought provoking there, at least for me. And that aspect of, historically, honestly, the system's kind of been gamed, right? SEO. It's really just saying like, oh, how do I take my answer and get it up to the top of the page? How does, and then certainly, Google and others have monetized that game, right? Where I can pay to play and get, up at the top and such. Yet now we have this technology where honestly, I think the general consumer has, right or wrong, kind of put trust in of like, oh, this is just a generalized answer because it's so conversational and it's aggregated and such, where you just feel like, oh, it's a cumulative answer of knowledge, not so much a curated and monetized answer. And so how those two are going to come together, like you're saying, is really an interesting question, because then suddenly it's like, could you ask the same question and you get different answers today anyway, but you go to Grok or you go to Perplexity, or you can go to ChatGPT, and are they going to give you different answers because they are prioritizing certain content or words and such to kind of start to maybe bias is the right word, that they're going to start to allow bias in based off of who's kind of sponsoring the answer. So I think that's a really challenging, both ethical and technological question.
Yeah, and I think, if you kind of play that out and you say, well, these models are massive generalizers, and it's widely thought that large language models are really not going to get us to artificial general intelligence, right? Because they're just word relationship models, and intelligence is more complex than that. But if you want to deliver the equivalent of what kind of Google has delivered for the last couple decades, that allows you to connect into brands, into brand properties, then I think that right now the thinking, which is obviously very early stage, is, oh, how do we get our content into the training data of models? But I don't think that's not the long-term answer, right? That content is helping to make these models better generalizers, but it will never be the thing that makes it be able to kind of dig into the specificity of your brand and understand the nuances of it. I could totally see a world though where these like the ChatGPTs, the Perplexities of the world, instead of offering to kind of index and train on your data, maybe what they do is they route requests to your model, your brand model, and that's the equivalent of routing a request to a website, right? You curate your website, you put your data on it, and Google index it, and then route people there. So I think, and then you go, well, not every business is going to be able to create their own model. You start to go down in scale and things like that. It gets more challenging. But Google solved for that. If you again go back to what happened with search, okay, not everybody can run a massive website. Not everybody can run a huge nuanced AdWords campaign. So we'll build tools to make it easy for you to do that. So actually, we'll help you build your own little business model by you upload your content, you let us connect to your inventory, all that sort of stuff. We'll build you your model that then connects into our system. And when a request comes through that's relevant for you, we'll route to that. And the consumer then, I believe, should always be having a conversation with a model that comes from the brand, not the massive generalizing model, because that I think that is a bleak future. I don't really want to like live and be a consumer in that future, because I just think we know the risk of that is just massive homogenization.
Yeah, Graham, I think this is a good dovetail, right? This conversation here into kind of hype versus reality. Because I think a lot of our audience, they're in the marketing field, and there might be some outliers, right? They're listening to this on a regular basis. You just got back from Cannes, which is where a lot of the cutting edge stuff is kind of getting released or demoed. So you mentioned, I think it might have been in the current. I want to quote you, so get ready. You mentioned how many AI demos at Cannes felt more like a kind of click-through illusions, right? than truly operational tools. What specific criteria do you use to assess whether like an AI demo is genuine versus merely like performative or vaporware, right? What are things that you're looking at that you're saying, man, this is ready to go? Where are we?
Yeah.
Where are we really?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I always want to establish is AI the thing, is it doing the thing that you're trying to sell me, or is it just some like augmentation layer on top that makes the thing conversational? Right? They're two, it's like saying, it's like putting I don't know, it's like using AI to make an engine sound on a Tesla because you like the sound of an engine, but actually it's something else that's powering the car. And there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe you'll get an awesome engine sound from AI, but it doesn't necessarily make the car any better at what it does. And I think there's many businesses that have gone down that route that say we're an AI business, but actually all they've done, again, just to reiterate, nothing wrong with this. All they've done is they've just added this new generative AI interactive layer on top of what they offer. So I think that's the first thing to establish. What is it that's doing this thing? And in some instances, there's there's nothing wrong with AI not doing the task that they're trying to sell you, because there's many, as you guys know, as very competent technologists and engineers, like um there are solutions out there that have already that provide very high quality outputs without using AI. There are just some things that work, and they should absolutely stay in place. And then I think, the next thing is, how connected is your system? So, if I'm really want to, I suppose, realize the benefits of AI, and this is one of the biggest challenges with the technology right now, is it's moved so rapidly. So many startups have emerged in this space, where it's created even more fragmentation than existed in an incredibly fragmented industry as it is in advertising. And so many of these advantages and efficiencies that are supposed to be gained are not realized, and not even come anywhere close to be realized, because the fragmentation has just increased a bit further, and your system doesn't connect into the next system, the next handoff. And I think anybody who has played around with agents, and just generally in ChatGPT, you don't even need to build agents, but just tried to deliver a task, what you very rapidly realize is that tasks are way more complex than we give them credit for. Writing a piece of content is not just one task for us. We take it for granted, but we think about what we want to write about. We then maybe plan out what that might look like as a skeleton. We then start to write it. We get feedback. We iterate on it. In an agentic sense, that's probably half a dozen agents at the very least that are doing things. And for something to be, in my opinion, for something to be truly AI driven, I don't want to have to take the output from my idea agent and physically copy and paste it into the input for the next agent that takes those ideas and starts to write a skeleton. And so I think it's entirely reasonable that if someone is claiming to sell you an AI solution, that clunkiness has to go away. It has to be frictionless, and you can't claim for it to be a workflow if every step in that workflow requires for you to, put the thing down that you're holding, catch your breath, and then lift it back up and pass it to the next person in the workflow. And so there's some of the things that I think about. I do think that I also like to ask, what is powering, what AI are they using? And responses are very interesting, because you'll get some people that kind of, or some businesses that say, oh, we proudly use OpenAI, we only use OpenAI, we've got this partnership with them, whatever that is. That's just an example. But I don't think that's a plus, right? I think if you view things as these models are, majority of their training data is the corpus of the internet, right? But the only thing that makes it unique is the data, like their data that they've either acquired or that they generate as a business. So by that, you would assume Llama models are better at creating meta ads, that Google models are better at creating Google ads. And therefore, if you advertise on those two platforms, you should at the very least have two families of models. But we know that the reality is for any given task situation, any one of those models could be the right model for that task. I don't think there will ever be one model to rule them all. And again, coming back to this idea of them being massive generalizers, you just don't want that in your advertising plans, campaigns for you as a brand. So to me, a solid piece of AI tech has to have a curated ecosystem of models that are diverse, and has to have the ability to select models that are appropriate for any given task that it delivers. And if it can't do that, I think it's too rigid. I think that you're just pushing everybody down this one route. And in advertising, that's definitely not where we want to go, right? We don't want to say to two brands that operate in the same category, yes, I understand that your advertising now looks vaguely similar, but there's nothing we can do about that because the technology uses the same model. Like that answer's not gonna wash with anybody.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, massive fragmentation as well as rapid innovation, right? I mean, every day there seems to be new kind of features or aspects to how AI can be delivered. I mean, we've only been in this conversation for like 18 months, and we've gone from the release of kind of the first LLM to now agentic platforms that are able to actually execute complex complex workflows on behalf of a person, and in some cases without even a human in the middle anywhere, which has its own challenges. For a listener that's like at an agency or, on the CMO organization at a large brand, how do they get started? Like, how do they manage this rapid increase in innovation? What would you recommend? Like, how would you kind of like start moving in this direction?
Really, really big question, and very important question, but big. And again, I don't know if there's a one size fits all. I think the first thing is how open is your organization to using AI? Because your first step might just be convincing people that you have to get on this train, otherwise it's going to have left the station and you are just not going to be able to catch up with it. And I use the analogy of a kind of race a lot when I'm talking about AI, because I understand that the most common question is, what efficiency is AI driving? But ultimately, we're in a race to win customers for brands. And if your focus is on, well, how do I maintain the same speed I'm at but keep it more efficient, then somebody else who's hungry and realizes the potential of this technology will go, well, I'm just going to go faster. And I'm going to go faster with the same amount of people or the same amount of resources, whether they're people or not, and do more with it, right? So I think, first of all, has got to be, what is the stance in the business around using AI? And there has to be a realization that even for brands, say, I think regulated industries is one thing, but I honestly believe that the use of AI in regulated industries is a well-trodden path, because it's not that different from ensuring that you're adhering to data privacy and security, and all those things that we've been talking about for many, many, many years. I don't believe it's that different. I think where it's kind of interesting is when you get brands that are, let's say, iconic, and their brand, the characters in their brand, the products have been created by human creativity. And then there starts to be a little bit of preciousness about, well, we will always be a human creative brand. And that's okay. But But you can't kind of hamstring yourself by saying, well, because we're always going to be a human created brand, we're not going to let AI run some of the operational aspects of our business that will just make us move faster, remove some of the barriers in place. So that's the first part of it. I think the 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 second is we're we're an industry of silos, right? We love to create silos. And maybe it's unfair to say we're an industry. We are a species of silos. We live in different places, we speak different languages, we have all these different preferences, and these things all equate to barriers that come up at some point. And so you then apply that to work and you say, well, I have a department that I'm going to massively simplify. A department that analyzes audiences, department that plans media, department that executes media, a department that analyzes the outcomes of it. So straight away, I've got four departments. So you go, well, they're four skill sets, but actually they're four silos because the people that build audiences might not and possibly cannot see everything that goes on in media planning and just physically can't. I can't. There's no option for me, Kyle and Dustin to just plug ourselves into some system and then be aware of everything that we're doing and thinking and everything we've ever experienced in our lives. But agents can do, right? So to me, the first place we should be thinking about applying AI in our industry is breaking down silos. So, where we can start to reveal information that was not traditionally exposed across departments, functions, things like that within a brand, and in a privacy kind of compliant sense. I'm not talking about sharing information across brands. I'm talking about sharing within a company. Because that's where it's one thing replacing human workflows with AI. But again, all you're going to get to is status quo, just status quo cheaper. But, if we're not in this to do things better, what's the point, in my opinion? I mean, that's just my opinion, but like I want to do things better and differently. So why are we not questioning the silos that exist and focusing on breaking those down? So I do believe that you should be able to get better outcomes because the knowledge can be really easily shared across agents. Now, I'm not saying that to negate a human interaction. I think it's a different conversation where humans come into play with this. And I think we've got a whole learning journey as human beings to maybe rediscover what it means to be a human being. I think we've forgotten a long time ago. But that doesn't and shouldn't stop building agentic flows that break silos down, because they are the things that you're gonna do better advertising as a consequence of those silos coming down. It has to be better, right? The thought that somebody that's doing something down the chain knew everything that went into the decision making process that came before them, why wouldn't that make a better outcome?
Love that. Graham, with that in mind, so you talked about kind of breaking down the business silos and kind of some of the organizational back office stuff. Let's talk for a second about the creative side. Is it, you're talking about what is it that makes us human, the nuance and the creativity, and in the context of an ad agency, right? That's one of the big services that we offer. And I think one of the big questions is, how far is AI going to, kind of take over or consume that creative mindset, or like literally the creative, what you visually see coming in on an ad. And there's always been this promise of one-to-one, right, that we haven't really quite lived up to, but AI actually gets us to a point to where there is an actual possibility of that, but it comes with its own risk and ethical risk and bias and things like that. How do we, and what's your take on how far we allow AI to get into that creative process?
Yeah, again, really, really interesting territory, and one that I think has got a long way to go before it's played out. So I think first and foremost, AI absolutely has the ability, as we know, to create beautiful imagery. But ultimately, these models are, again, coming back to this idea of a large language model. It's built on semantic relationships between words, which is not intelligence, and equally is not creativity. There is a multidimensionality to intelligence and creativity. I was somebody talked to me about the example of, if I say the word apple, right? As a human being, you might think about the food, the brand. You might think of the color, a color, red color, a green color. But you could have also, you might have choked on an apple as a child. So your thoughts and feelings and memories, like all these dimensions, are triggered by this one word. Large language models don't behave like that. They're looking at, how often in their training data this word has been related to other words and how it's related. So, it's just as an aside, it's interesting that Llama and Meta, sorry, have, their latest Llama model was actually kind of not perceived as, it was kind of perceived as a bit of a failure. It didn't really stack up from a performance perspective against other large language models, but they are taking a different approach now, where they are trying to address this multidimensionality of intelligence so that they can get towards artificial general intelligence, rather than just keep kind of pushing tiny increments of large language model performance. The reason that's important is that, I suppose the point I'm making is, right now, I think creativity in its purest sense is still entirely like in our domain, right? In its purest sense. There's a difference between production, which is like iterating, creating versions of things. But I heard one of the CEOs in one of our large businesses just yesterday talk about the idea that AI should absolutely be used for iteration on a great idea, but the great idea right now still kind of has to come from a human being, because there's just so much to those ideas that cannot really be recreated with any kind of generative model as it exists right now. What I do think is really interesting is, we've done research into how do you start to scratch the surface of what creativity, how you tease out creativity in something like a large language model. So we've been experimenting with adding these dynamics into large language models. So we might have multiple agents interacting with each other, and we will inside the system itself, we will essentially give them these dynamics. We have personal dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, and contextual dynamics. So a good example is, let's say we have a strategy agent and a creative agent. We would define that they have a healthy rivalry, right? If you have a multi-agent system, we might say that it's a Monday morning and nobody wants to be in work, right? Or it's even, it's raining outside. That's a contextual dynamic. And then we might just give them a personal dynamic, like, you didn't sleep very well last night and you're tired, or I don't know, you had a great weekend and you're in a good mood. And honestly, when we add those types of dynamics in, the outputs fundamentally change. They become what we would all call creative. And it makes total sense, because we're asking the models to consider something that has no bearing on the task that they've been given. And all they want to do is generalize to the thing that you've asked them to do, but you're forcing them to go, well, why do I feel tired, and what does tired even make me feel like? And so you had heard me say this before, but I call it like sprinkling a bit of chaos into AI. I think we live in a dynamic, chaotic world as human beings, and we take it for granted that we just deal with that. But these systems want order, and they impose order as well. And so we have to, if you want to get creativity out of them, you have to impose chaos on that system, and actually reduce the level of organization in there, because otherwise it will always just come to that most general average answer.
Wow. I think some people might be having an existential moment right now. That's very fascinating response, Graham, and that addition of chaos to creativity. I mean, I think that alone it deserves its entire podcast of itself. Wow. And yeah, that friction, I think that's dead on. I mean, we have to think about how our lives just naturally flow. A lot of people call them biorhythms, right? Or whatever. It's like if you can model that and kind of mimic, because some days you just don't know. You wake up in a bad mood.
And some of this is hard coded into us at this point in our lives, right? Like,
Yeah.
when I heard about the llama approach, my first thought was, well, actually, then, once if you can recreate the multidimensionality of intelligence, then what sets one model apart from another could be something as silly as its temperament. Like, do I want a model that has a bad temperament or a model that has a good temperament? It sees the sunny side of life, but you might want that mixture of models working on a task to get something that's different from somebody else, like, out of it. And it's really, really interesting when you kind of go down that rabbit hole and you start to think about really these things that we find fairly trivial and just part of our lives. They actually are really important to how these models may well become even more powerful and useful in the future.
Yeah, I love that thought, or maybe it even scares me some, but that thought that you start with at the beginning of just current just iteration kind of leads to homogeneity, right? And whether it's in the model or when we start thinking about personal agents now doing things on our behalf, and the thought of, is there going to be an advertising agent that is advertising to personal agents? And so now you've got this dual system, trying to just, advertise to itself. And because they're systems without that chaos, like you're talking about, it's likely they're going to just slowly devolve into, very homogenous. What is like the fastest, quickest, shortest route to an answer? And suddenly my personal agent may just be buying things just because they found some common lowest common denominator, which was like price or whatever, and suddenly they're just acting along the parameters they've been given, but it's ultimately going to lead to a place that's not effective. And so how do you continue to manage that as these agents and models start to play on both sides of the equation? Because right now it's just really consumers interacting with one, but now when they start to interact with each other, how do you bring in that kind of that chaos or that creativity so that they just don't devolve down into lowest common denominator? What's the most efficient thing that the two systems can do between each other? I think that's a really mind-boggling thought.
On top of that, it's like that makes me think about like legal agency for agents, or maybe the requirement of legal agencies or entities for agents for legal ramifications. Because what if an agency steals from my agent? How do you understand the source of the action? How can you track it, like from a ledger, and have immutable evidence when you weren't humanly involved in the transaction? It's like, who's liable in that instance? I mean, these are all huge ethical and legal type questions, right? That I don't know that are completely answered yet, right?
Yeah, and I think that they, if anything, expose us as human beings maybe to even more legal risk. I think there's been less of a focus on that, but if let's say a content owner is suing an AI model provider for using their content in their training materials, how is that in many ways any different from you as a child reading a book and then 30, 40 years later using a concept out of that book, but you're not consciously using that concept, you're just using it because it was your training data. You know, it was, at what point do you start to distinguish, because the process is the same, right? So why should an AI model company be at any more risk than a human being that actually went through an identical process? And therefore, by pursuing these legal cases, are we actually exposing ourselves to greater risk in the future? Because these systems are built to mimic the way that we learn.
Yeah. And a lot of it too, like you have to go back, like we're talking about like LLM scraping the open internet, like ESPN. ESPN pays a publisher, that it costs them. That article is relevant for a certain amount of time, so it might be like time bound contracts, right? Things like that have to be, take, because your analogy. I mean, I've not thought about that. It's like I've read a lot of material from people that I didn't necessarily pay for in books that got it in the library, and it's part of my model now. So. But that was a long time ago. Is it relevance? What are the metrics that the legal system has to take in consideration now in the agentic world? I mean, I think those are some fascinating things to think about.
Yeah, and maybe it's the reason why lawyers might not lose their jobs so quickly, even though I think the legal industry has been one of those that's been touted as being heavily disrupted by AI. Maybe the reason we need human lawyers is for them to start to think about some of these more complex AI and legal problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, man, this conversation could go on probably forever, just because it's such a fascinating topic and everything. We are running out of time, though. And so, Graham, since we're on AI, we've kind of gone to a kind of standard wrap-up question that is actually AI based, and it is, if you fed all the data about Graham into AI, what are the 3 words it would generalize to describe you?
Yeah, I suppose so. Let me talk you through my thought process for this. It very much comes from like how we think about advertising and data that would be available, as opposed to like this idea that's not real, that all my data could be fed into somebody. So I was thinking, well, what data has existed on me, since I was born? So obviously one thing that I alluded to in the intro at the start was the international aspect, right? I think if something was analyzing my data, it would go, well, he's been in Manchester, he's been in Melbourne, Australia, he's been in New York, but even in those countries and continents, he's lived in different places and traveled to lots. So like just international and travel would definitely be like, one of those words. Another one is I generalized it as hobbies. And the reason being is I'm the sort of person who I figure out the next thing I want to do and I just go and do it. I recently got my motorcycle license. I'd never ridden one before. I was like, right, that's what I'm going to do. But I've always been into cycling. The moment you could kind of like upload data, record data with cycling, I was always doing that with any app, even like, food consumption, calories, all that sort of stuff. So like I generalized as hobbies, but all my hobbies generally involve like some sort of app that I'm uploading data to. So I assume there's like a tremendous amount of data on my cycling and eating habits. And then finally, just because of the job that I do and doing things like this, if you search for me on the internet, there's obviously a lot of reference and relevance to advertising, because it's been a big part of my life for half of my life. And so I think, yeah, my 3 words are international, hobbies, and advertising.
Love it.
Love it. That's very well thought out, and man, it's pretty cool to it's a cool question to think about, right? I kind of want to go back, and I kind of don't think you and I have done this for ourselves. We probably need to do that at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
But Graham, thank you so much for being a guest on today's episode. We certainly want to have you back sometime soon. And for our listeners, we hope today's episode was informative and thought-provoking. I know it certainly was for Kyle and I. We would so appreciate it if you would take a few minutes and leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for listening to Real Talk About Marketing, an Acxiom podcast. You can find all our podcasts at acxiom.com/Real Talk or on your favorite podcast platform.